Could we be on the verge of Ukraine peace talks? And just what could it all mean? As American and Russian negotiators meet in Saudi Arabia to discuss the possible start of negotiations to end the 3-year war, here are some of your questions about what it all means and what could come next. Hello and welcome. If you're new to the channel, my name is James Ker-Lindsay, and here I take an informed look at international relations, conflict, security and statehood. So, Stuart Hall 3874 asks, what does victory look like for Ukraine? And likewise, what does victory look like for Russia? So, Stuart, thank you very much for this, because I think this in many ways really does raise a fundamental question about where these talks are going to go, if in fact they do start. Because I think the positions of the sides are quite clearly very, very different from each other. I mean, all right, that's something you could say is in the case of any conflict. But I think in this one, for reasons I'll talk about in a minute, it's even more significant. So, I mean, we clearly know what the position of the two parties, the fundamental starting position of the two parties would be. So Ukraine's position would be a return of all territory that is under Russian occupation, including Crimea, and its right to choose its own future, which includes NATO membership. Now, of course, the Russian position is going to be absolutely diametrically opposed to that. So Russia's position is, well, we have now conquered this territory. As far as we're concerned, we have annexed it. It's our territory. We can't and won't return it. That there should be absolutely no NATO membership for Ukraine. And I think Russia would like to see an end to the current government in Ukraine and a regime that is far more to its liking. But when we talk about peace processes, I mean, in many cases, what we're talking about is what is a realistic meeting point for those positions. My concern in this case is that there isn't a realistic meeting point for the positions, especially on the question of territory, because, as I've said many times, we are now at the possibility that what we will see is, if Russia is allowed to keep the territory that it's invaded and occupied, this will be the most significant and one of the very few examples since 1945 of where a country has invaded, occupied and annexed territory, and that has been accepted. In actual fact, one would argue that it would be the only case where that has happened in that way. I can't think of any other where there was such an example of one sovereign state invading the territory of another sovereign state and then annexing that territory and formally saying, well, look, it's ours, and then the international community signing off on it. Now, you could get the argument that if Ukraine was willing to accept that, then that legalizes it, yes, but there's also the position that that would be done under duress, that would not have really been a consensual agreement. And I think it opens up so many difficulties for international relations. But of course, one has to balance that against the fact is that you can say having principles, but there is a conflict in place. And this is a conflict that many now argue that, rightly or wrongly, Ukraine can't win. So what is the outcome that would end the fighting, but wouldn't in actual fact sign off on the dotted line? And it is an incredibly complex set of questions that hopefully I'll touch on in some of the other questions that I'm going to answer. But essentially, what we would really be looking at is, I think, that a full final peace agreement that would accept that Russian annexation is highly unlikely. What we're probably more likely to be talking about, and I know that there will be a lot who will be very unhappy about this, is essentially a ceasefire and a frozen conflict. That what would happen is it would essentially say, right, okay, Russia, you hold this territory. There's not much that Ukraine can do about it at the moment. But the international community is not going to sign off on what is quite clearly an illegal land grab. It becomes complicated because I think that would probably be the better outcome in many people's minds from a European and a Ukrainian perspective. But I'm not sure that that would be the outcome that the United States would be looking for all sorts of reasons. So I think we really are in a very strange position with this conflict as to what we could see as being, to use the terminology, the landing zone of an eventual agreement. And I think this is actually part of the reason why so many people are very skeptical about the way that this process is going to go. Because there are these fundamental differences, but there are also fundamental differences which have the potential to upend international relations if allowed to remain in place. So if Russia is allowed to take hold of these territories in Ukraine, then what's to stop it saying, well, thank you very much, we will now formally annex Abkhazia. We will formally annex South Ossetia. Transnistria is a little bit more difficult because it's separated from Russia by Ukraine. But I think it's really very problematic. So I think, when you ask what is victory for the two sides, we know what victory is. It's how do you square that with this peace process? And I think as a lot of observers will be saying, that the direction that the Trump administration has been taking, not just in starting this process without consulting with its allies, without consulting with Ukraine, but also laying out some very clear positions as far as it's concerned. So, for example, J.D. Vance saying, well, Ukraine will have to give up territory, is extremely disturbing on all sorts of levels. So, as I say, I think we know what the sides would view as victory. And as I say, in many cases, you'd be able to then say, right, okay, what's a sensible meeting point? But I think in this case, what we're talking about is so profound for its implications for international relations that I think a lot of countries will rightly be very, very concerned about being seen to sort of come up with a halfway agreement that says to Moscow, yes, all right, you can keep some of this territory. It would have truly profound implications for international relations, which would affect the nature of international security, I think, for the rest of this century. Teacher Talk P7i asks, what are Trump's political and economic objectives and priorities in this negotiation? You really hit on the big question I think we all have in our minds. How exactly does the Trump administration view this process? What is it that they're trying to achieve with these talks? I think there's a whole range of different issues that we have here that are very difficult to unpack. And it's not that there's just one explanation. I think there could be several explanations. I mean, I think one of the factors quite clearly is Trump himself. And I think there's several factors here. I think there's Trump's sense of vanity, that he wants to be the person who has solved this conflict. People have pointed out he deeply resented the fact that Obama was given the Nobel Peace Prize, and frankly, for not really doing very much. And Trump no doubt feels that he is deserving of the prize. So maybe that in one way is driving what he's doing. I think there's also a very clear business element that could be in this. Russia obviously has extreme number of minerals and resources that Trump may feel, look, if we do a peace deal, and this is something that, you can see quite clearly from the way that the Russians are framing this, that they see this as a very much about opening the way for a return to business with the United States. And I suspect that Trump is seeing it in exactly the same way. I think a third factor that comes into this is maybe Trump, who is fixated on China, would say this is potentially the best way to peel Russia off from China. And if in his mind he has to make a calculation of which is the greater enemy to the United States, is it Russia or is it China? Then maybe there are many in the administration who would say, well, in actual fact, it's China. This is the long-term strategic challenger to the United States, the long-term strategic threat to the United States, much more so than Russia. But China needs Russia. It needs that a lot of the Russian minerals. And so maybe the best way of separating out Russia and China, which and that relationship has become a lot closer because of Ukraine, is to reach a deal and then start to bring Russia back into engaging with the United States, and perhaps, dangle before Putin the chance that, look, if you deal with me and we can get that agreement going, then that is going to open the door for other countries. And I think in many ways he's probably right. I don't know whether the Europeans would immediately fall into line, but they would then be potentially left in a very difficult situation if Russia then turns around and says, well, if America then turns around and says, we're going to deal with Russia, you've got a lot of other countries which are happy to deal with Russia, China, India, many African states, they're not going to be held back by this. And so maybe Putin knows this, that if he can do the deal with the United States and leave Europe isolated, then eventually European states will start to falter. Some of the more pro-Russian ones will break ranks with EU partners, refuse to introduce any more sanctions and things. So it'll slowly open his way. So in terms of what I think is behind this, I think it's a complex range of factors. So I think it's partly Trump's own wish to see a settlement because he sees this as a way of burnishing his reputation and his standing in history. I think there is a business agenda here. I think there is an element that he wants to peel Russia away from China. And I think on top of all of this, I don't think there is any great love for Europe and what Europe might be feeling about all of this. So that sense of, why should we care what the Europeans think and if they don't like it? So as I say, I think there's a complex range of reasons behind it. But what I think is very clear is that what we are seeing now from the United States seems to be a divergence, a fundamental divergence from Europe. And the big question that obviously everyone now is really asking is how is Europe going to respond to this, which is, I think, going to be a very, very important challenge that European partners will be facing in all of this, especially if it looks likely that after this first meeting in Riyadh, that there are going to be further meetings, and the United States seems very keen to push ahead with this agenda. So CC Lilford asks, does America really have the leverage to force a peace deal without Europe's approval? And whatever happened to the coalition of the willing? I think this ties in really closely with the previous point about this divergence that we're seeing between the United States and Europe. And this is a really, really crucial question because, I was just looking through some of the reactions that we've been seeing to this US-Russia meeting, and the fact that Europe has quite clearly been sidelined from this, the fact that Russia is making it very clear that it won't allow Europe to have a seat at the table, will no doubt make many European leaders very nervous. And there is this question of what happens if the United States essentially carves out a deal with Russia and presents it to Ukraine and says, listen, take it or leave it. And if you leave it, then our support for you stops. Our military support for you stops. Our aid money for you stops. And I think that, as somebody pointed out, if Europe wants to stand behind Ukraine, then it's got to come up with a deal of its own, or at least a model for continuing support that would lead somewhere. And that would, I think, probably see a dramatic escalation of the crisis and potentially create a rift with the United States. And so I think, yes, potentially, Europe could come back with something, but I think at that moment, I think the worry that Ukraine will probably have, and a lot of European leaders will have, is that could signal the final break with the United States. And even though I think a lot of people are very unhappy with the direction the United States is taking, they're very nervous about what is happening in the United States at the moment. I think, and for good reason, there's a genuine worry about breaking altogether with Washington. I think part of that is because it's very deeply held to most people, or to many people, certainly. And I have to say that I would certainly, it's something that makes me very nervous about some sort of definitive break from the United States. But at the same time, many would argue that if the United States is just laying down the terms of what would be a fundamentally unjust, and many would argue a dangerous settlement that effectively has handed Putin what he wants, then a lot would say, well, maybe that is the moment that Europe has to stand up for Ukraine. But that could come at a very heavy cost, because if the United States then says, right, fine, okay, you've made your decision, you're on your own, Europe will have to provide the troops that, or would have to certainly provide a lot more military aid to Ukraine. And it would have to provide a lot more financial support to Ukraine. So essentially, I think the problem is that what we're looking at is that whether we like it or not, as things stand at the moment, yes, the United States could very well have the leverage to force a peace deal through on Ukraine without Europe's approval, because it could just say to Kyiv, look, if you don't take this, then we cut off support. And then unless Europe can come back and say, well, in that case, we will continue support with all that entails, including the possible risk of an escalation, because Putin might at that point turn around and say, well, look, if the United States is now broken from Europe and saying Ukraine is no longer our issue, then maybe Russia feels emboldened to say, right, okay, we can expand this war in one way or another that we like, because is the United States going to come to Europe's defence? And there would be real questions about this. So this is actually a huge question. I think, this is why so many European countries are very nervous about this unilateral move that the United States has made, because they feel exactly that if the United States were to cut a deal with Russia and then take that to Ukraine, then Ukraine might feel that it has no option to accept if they can't come up with an alternative. So DH16DH asks, are Eastern European countries being overlooked and underappreciated within Europe, given that only Poland was invited by Macron to the recent emergency meeting? I think you touch on a very important point about the way that the European Union has evolved, that it's tended to be very focused, and for obvious historical reasons, on Western Europe. And there has been this question of, have the Eastern European countries been given their place? I come at this a little bit differently for two reasons. I mean, I think it's quite clear that you couldn't have all the countries in Europe around that table, that it had to be focused on a select group. For many reasons. One, because I think it just would have been out of hand if you had not just the 27, but obviously United Kingdom was involved, so, former EU member. But also you had like the Secretary General of NATO and everything. So I think it was a sense of what is manageable. And within that, it was clearly noticeable that Poland was there. So there was that clear acknowledgement that Poland was an important partner in all of this and needed to be at that top table. I would have been very worried if Poland wasn't there. But the fact that it was there said that I don't think that Eastern Europe is being overlooked. I think what was also very interesting is that you had a decision that was taken by the Nordics, the Scandinavians, I can never remember how you define them, and the Baltics to be represented by Denmark. So that was also a very powerful message to say that they represent a bloc that are aligned in their views, and they were willing to allow one of their number to speak on their behalf at that. So again, I think it's very clear that you could say, well, look, because you didn't have perhaps Romania, Bulgaria there, maybe one of those two could have been included. Romania might have been a good example to have in the lineup. But I think the fact that you had Poland, which is the most significant of the Eastern European countries, especially on the question of how to handle Russia, was very important. And as I say, the fact that you had the Baltics and a group of the Scandinavian states represented in the case of Denmark, I think was actually a very, very good sign of the way that countries are working with one another within the European Union, that they can form regional blocs as well and nominate one of their number to speak on their behalf. So I'm not quite as worried about this as it might seem. Yes, as I say, I think Eastern Europe's voice was very, very clearly heard in the meeting. So Georges Custafan asks, should Turkey and China participate as intercessors in the peace negotiation? George, thank you for bringing this up, because I think what you're touching on is a really interesting question about who will lead any talks that do take place. And this is fundamentally important, as we know, in peace processes. I mean, what will be going on at the moment is a lot of discussion about process, and process is incredibly important in peace processes in all sorts of ways. And it breaks down into any number of factors, and this is just one of them, but it's an important one. So what we would be sort of thinking about, or what I think we'll be keeping an eye out in the next few weeks, is if this ramps up and it looks like it's going to become a formal process, where is it going to be held? What is the format that's it's going to be run under? And there are a number of different formats. You can have direct talks, you can have mediated process, you can have what's called proximity talks. So effectively what you do is you can have the different parties either in the same building or even actually quite separate from each other, and somebody sort of shuttles between them and sort of says, right, okay, this is what the Russian position is. How do you feel about this? And simplifying it, but essentially that's what it is. But if it is going to be a mediated process, there is this question as to who should be there. And alternatively, you could have it that, if it were to be the case that the United States says, okay, we're going to be there, the Ukrainians are going to be there, and the Europeans manage to force their way into this, which I happen to think is important to do for all sorts of reasons, then it might be the case that Russia says, well, we want another country there, and that could be China. Or alternatively, as you're saying, that what we could have is a question of who will be the effectively brokering the process. Now, we've seen this meeting in Riyadh, which has been a significant boost for Saudi Arabia's standing, that it can say, listen, we have got this position that we can actually get United States and Russia to the table. But yes, I mean, there is a very good question about who might be able to do that. I think Turkey is problematic in all sorts of ways. I think that because it's a NATO member, but you could argue that it's a NATO member that in many ways has retained very good relations with Russia, much to the annoyance and suspicion of many other NATO members, I hasten to add. But I'm not sure that it would be able to fulfill that role. And I'm not also sure that China would want to. Yes, in some ways it would be a significant step forward for its standing in the world, but I think the United States would be very, very unhappy about having China playing that role. So I think you raise a really interesting question about who could do that. But once you start to actually think about it, who's got alliances with whom, what are the interested parties in all of this, then it becomes a very, very different debate. And I wouldn't be surprised if the United States actually sees itself as being the mediator. That effectively it says, listen, if we can cut a good relationship with Russia and persuade Putin that actually what we want is to improve our relations with Russia, then maybe Washington says, well, why can't we be the ones who bring the Russians and the Ukrainians into the room together to talk to each other? So I wouldn't necessarily rule out, I mean, as strange as it might seem in some ways, that might be something that Washington sees, its role as being. But this is certainly one of those really, really big questions. And I know you sort of framed it in particular two countries, but I think it opens up a much bigger debate about exactly who is going to take a role, in what capacity, and that will have to be something that will be open to discussions in the coming weeks if it looks like formal negotiations are actually on the cards. 1989 asks, if a deal does take place, how likely is it that the Russian territorial gains are akin to the lines drawn by current military positions? Look, so this again comes back to the point about what is likely to be discussed and whether we have a ceasefire, which effectively freezes the conflict, or we have a peace agreement, a formal peace agreement that in some ways acknowledges Russian sovereignty over the territory that it holds, or whether it could be something which is a little bit more nebulous, which sort of lays down the potential for a broader peace agreement that would allow some decision to be taken on that territory at a later date. So that could either mean a referendum held to retain its links with Russia, or the possibility of some sort of agreement that would allow the territory to be reintegrated into Ukraine, for example, under very high degree of autonomy, or perhaps a federal settlement or something like that. But of course, there is also the question about, what lines get drawn. And of course, where it becomes really interesting at the moment is we're not just talking about the lines on the map in Ukraine, but we have the lines on the map in Russia, because, of course, Ukraine has, and it's a very small amount of territory, but it is nevertheless Russian sovereign territory that Ukraine is now occupying as well. And I think, there's an argument to say, well, look, if you're going to draw a ceasefire line that paves the way for a later settlement, then it makes sense to allow Ukraine to sit holding that territory, because it then potentially gives Russia an incentive to regain it. I mean, it is so small as compared to the amount of territory it holds in Ukraine. But I think nevertheless, there's a certain symbolism here that territory that Russia says is our sovereign territory is now sitting in Ukrainian hands, that I think gives it a much greater degree of significance than it might otherwise have had. So I think that's going to be a really, really interesting question. But I mean, one would rather expect that with the possibility of some adjustments, that if we're talking about a ceasefire agreement, then it probably will be along the lines of the territory that's currently held at the moment. And I'm not necessarily expecting to see Russia giving up a large amount of that territory, especially as, particularly, Donetsk and Luhansk and Crimea, it's now said represents Russian territory. And, I've seen people arguing, well, Russia can't give up territory under its constitution. Yeah, but this was illegally gained. This is not, so it's a little bit deeper than that. But essentially, as I say, I think that we probably will be talking about the lines that on the map that we currently see at the moment, in terms of where the rough discussions on territory is likely to be. Treasure Wolspolnata asks, what countries from Europe and outside of Europe could participate in a stabilisation force? Thanks so much for this, because again, I think what I'm trying to do with a lot of these questions is take a really good question to raise a bigger point in what we're seeing in these talks. And I think that this touches on a really, really important element of what sort of peacekeeping force or stabilisation force is the term you use, would we be talking about in the event of some sort of agreement? And this will be so important for a number of reasons. So in many cases, one would expect to see a UN peacekeeping force put in place. But I think in this case, there is a lot of reluctance to go down that path. From all sorts of angles. And I'm not sure that a UN peacekeeping force, in fact, I'm almost certain that a UN peacekeeping force wouldn't be an appropriate option in this case. Partly to do with rules of engagement. I think that Ukraine would turn around and say, when you put in a UN peacekeeping force, they're not allowed to fight back. Very strict rules of engagement, that essentially their position is a moral authority, that they stand on a line between two conflicting parties, and they expect that the two parties respect their position as UN peacekeepers enough not to fight their way through them. I don't think Ukraine, I don't think Europe would feel that this is a strong enough guarantee, that there is no reason to say that, Russia wouldn't at some point of its choosing push past those UN peacekeepers, knowing that they can't fight back. So I think Ukraine, and especially given the guarantees that Ukraine had in the past, which it would say weren't in the end worth the paper they were written on, would say we want to have a much greater, a more significant force that Russia would be afraid to push past. And so that then gets into sort of bigger questions. So, I mean, we're talking a lot at the moment. There's talk of Europe saying, well, we could put a force on the ground and things, which would mean that. But that also relies on the fact then that Russia is saying it's not prepared to go to war with the European countries. And I'm not sure that Europe would be confident that's not the case. So you would then want to involve other countries. Now, the ultimate guarantee in all of this would, of course, be the United States. If you had US soldiers on the ground, I think at that point, Russia would take a deep intake of breath and would say, yeah, no, we're not going to go there. But I'm not sure that Russia would accept that model of peacekeeping anyway, so you get into all sorts of discussions, but partly because it would then say, well, if you've got Europeans and you've got Americans on the ground, then this is NATO in effect. Whether or not Ukraine joins NATO, it's NATO in effect. So at that point, I think that the Russians probably would, and the Europeans would probably want to have potentially other countries there that would be close to Russia. The trouble is, could they be trusted by the Ukrainians? Any country that would be sort of, trusted enough by Russia. I mean, it's not unrealistic to feel this way. So what about Chinese troops? What about Indian troops, for example? Could they be an element of this? And where would you place them on the line? Because, of course, if you say, right, okay, if it's Indian troops and they're put in one place, does that then become a weak point that Russia would simply indicate to India, look, we're preparing to do an invasion. We're going to push past where your troops are. You better move them out the way and not stop us from doing what we want to do. So you get into very, very complex questions that don't come up with UN peacekeeping forces, where the sides do by and large respect the authority of the UN. But I think in this case, the feeling would be that that isn't going to be enough. But then you get into very complex questions about who could do that role. So again, I think that this is a really, really huge element. And I think hopefully also, along with the other questions that I'm answering, serves to underscore just how complex these negotiations are going to be. I mean, a lot of people just think, well, let's freeze the conflict and Ukraine doesn't join NATO. And that seems to be the position the United States is taking on this. It's a lot more than that. There will be questions about the process. There will be questions about the implementation. And this is one of those questions. Du Bois asks, is Ukraine's desire to join NATO still a possibility? And will the rest of NATO have a seat at the table? Again, this follows on directly from the previous question about peacekeeping, because this is, of course, another one of those factors that will really have to be thought about in any negotiating process. So it seems that the United States is now of the view, certainly the Trump administration is of the view, that Ukraine won't be joining NATO. I think that Ukraine certainly sees this as not just viable, but essential to its future security. You have Keir Starmer as British Prime Minister saying that NATO, that Ukraine still has a path to NATO membership. I think there will be a lot of other European countries that feel the same way, that ultimately it's only NATO membership that is going to provide Ukraine with the security that it needs, and many would argue that it deserves. You have the question about what you do about the division and how you deal with that if Ukraine becomes a member. But I think that can be addressed with a there is a political formula for that, of saying, look, Ukraine is divided, but it was divided not of its own will, and that, yes, a ceasefire exists. NATO membership will only extend to that ceasefire line. So if Russia were to set foot across that ceasefire line, then that would be Article 5. But that doesn't apply to the territories that are currently under Russian occupation. So effectively, it would kick it down kick the whole issue down the line to a later stage, maybe when you have a change of government in Russia at some point in the future that might be more in line with trying to do a deal. But a lot of that would also then depend on Europe's relationship with Russia. Is Europe holding back enough to make that sort of worthwhile, to do a land settlement at some point, which finally resolves that issue? So you've got a whole range of those points that sort of come into it as well. So yes, I would say that the desire to join NATO is still a possibility. It's probably unlikely because I think the United States, certainly under Trump, is not going to allow this. But I'm not. So in many ways, you could argue that the question here is, as part of an agreement, is it that you suspend NATO membership and United States gives an undertaking that this isn't on the path, or do you rescind any talk and just sort of set it in stone that Ukraine's future military orientation will be neutrality? And I think, a lot in Ukraine will feel very, very worried about that just opens up the door for a further Russian attack at a later stage. So again, just as it was with the peacekeeping, just as it was on the question of land, this is a hugely complex issue that will need to be discussed in a lot of detail. And we are also, again, seeing fairly large differences arising between the United States and certainly, if not all, the European Union, then I think a significant number of important EU members and other European countries. Branscombe asks, what will happen to the thousands of Ukrainian children allegedly abducted from the occupied areas? I am so pleased that you raised this issue because, again, this is another one of those questions that will have to be addressed. And I'm going to frame it in a slightly broader context because obviously this is incredibly important. It's important from a humanitarian point of view. It's also incredibly important because there is, of course, indictments against Vladimir Putin and another Russian official for having overseen that taking of those children from Ukraine. And remembering, of course, that under the Genocide Convention, taking children from a group constitutes genocide. So effectively, Russia has been accused of being complicit in genocide. Now, a lot would argue it's been accused of all sorts of other war crimes, and you're absolutely right. But this is incredibly important. But it also needs to be framed in the context of a bigger issue of, in this situation, there will have to be significant talks on prisoner exchanges. You've got a lot of prisoners of war that will have to be negotiated as well. So what I'm saying is that the question of hostages, of prisoners of war, will be a fundamentally important part of any overall peace deal. The Ukrainian government will say, we cannot possibly entertain the idea of an agreement with Moscow unless those children are returned. And I think a lot of countries will agree with that. But you're also dealing with a really interesting question, of course, because you have these indictments, against Putin and this other official. And whether Russia then says, as part of any peace agreement, well, we want this lifted somehow. And we know what the United States position on the International Criminal Court is at the moment. And I think this is where it's been really interesting that, one of the first things that was discussed after, during that talk between Trump and Putin was reciprocal visits to Washington and Moscow. And as we saw when Netanyahu went to Washington, Washington would happily, I think, welcome Putin, or certainly Trump would happily welcome Putin to Washington as part of this big plan that he's put together. But it would be welcoming somebody who is accused of very, very serious war crimes, not just on, obviously, as I say, abducting the children, but on a whole range of other issues. So to answer the question specifically, this is going to have to be another part of that process. It's dealing with the hostages, it's dealing with the prisoners of war, which will be a very, very thorny issue. Partly because also, in dealing with it, Russia will have to admit its guilt, in effect. It will have to say, yes, we took them. So it's one thing capturing prisoners, prisoners of war. It's one thing capturing soldiers and saying, yeah, we're holding on to them until the end of the war. Fine. It's a very different thing when you're then having to hold up your hands and say, yeah, here are all these children that we're going to hand back, and that shows that they had been taken. I mean, obviously Russia would say, well, we took them humanitarian, their family had been killed and that was all because of Ukraine's decisions and whatever. But it still will have to be something that will be addressed. And it will require mediation. So, for example, on prisoners of war, I've seen reports that the United Arab Emirates is taking a very keen role in doing that, and probably will go ahead. And I think probably on this, you will also be looking for third countries, which would then say, right, okay, we'll help deal with this issue. But it will be an incredibly important part in any process as well. Nathan Lowry asks, is this appeasement? Nathan, I'm sort of conflicted on this. I think part of me wants to say a clear yes, part of me wants to say no, and I think this is where the sort of historian side of my background clashes with the political science part of my background. I think appeasement was based on a misguided idea that you could do a deal, that Britain felt that it could do a deal with Nazi Germany, with Adolf Hitler, and that if Hitler was given what he demanded in Czechoslovakia, then that would be the end of the story. And of course, that was completely misguided. It was a policy that was based on naivety in many ways. I don't think that this is driven by the same factors, if I'm to be really honest. I don't think that there's a naivety that exists in the United States and in the Trump White House about what Putin will do. So I don't think it's that, they're saying to themselves, yes, if we give Putin what he wants on Ukraine, that'll be the end of the story. I think it's more that it's an apathy towards Europe, towards Ukraine, a complete disregard. I think it's just saying, look, we have a policy of making United States, make America great again. Our fundamental challenge is China. What does it take? And this comes back to the earlier question. What does it take to peel Russia off from China? I think, again, it's Trump saying, I don't really care what happens after. What I want is the acknowledgement that I solved this issue, and that, as long as it can stand for as long as I'm in the White House, that's all I care about. I think it's also that fact of, as I say, it comes back to that question. I think there's a business element, that it's sort of, this is a business opportunity that Russia is telling Trump, look, you solved this problem with us. We can open up we can do fantastic business, the biggest business you've ever seen. And I think all of that is appealing. So in that sense, yes, it is appeasement because it's giving Russia what it wants. But I think that the underlying factors, and I think that, for all the criticism of Chamberlain, I think that, he was essentially pursuing a policy that he felt might, it was better than war. But it led to war anyway. I think this is driven by a very, very different set of factors. But yes, I mean, I think I can see an argument that essentially the United States, for its own reasons, or certainly Trump for his own reasons and those around him, are willing to do a deal with Russia because they're looking to a very, very different set agenda. So again, it's yes and no. It is an appeasement like we saw with Hitler in the 1930s. But it is essentially sort of saying, right, okay, let's give Russia what it wants because then we will benefit from it in all sorts of ways as they see it. Dinaric Wolf asks, do you think a peace treaty would hold for long, or will the war eventually reignite again? This, of course, is really the big question in all of this, that whatever is agreed, how durable will it be? And there is obviously a great deal of skepticism in European circles about how much we can trust Putin. And I would say that I would completely go along with that. I think potentially, had it just been Ukraine, we could say, well, look, there were historic reasons as Russia saw it, not justifying those reasons for one moment, but it isn't just Ukraine that we're talking about. We're talking about territory of Georgia that has been, it was invaded and occupied, and, Russia has accepted the independence of those two breakaway territories. It's the same with Moldova. And then we've seen Ukraine. So this is part and parcel of a pattern that we have seen in Moscow. And so I think that there is a real fear that unless this agreement is put together very well, unless the proper guarantees are put in place, then what is to say that, as many argue, that Russia will simply sit behind that ceasefire line, rearm itself and wait till an opportune moment to push ahead. And of course, the other point to raise in all of this is that, very often what you find is even on these ceasefire lines, there's all sorts of incidents that take place. Sometimes it can be quite serious, hot incidents of troops firing against each other, but it's also little provocations the whole time. It's taking a bit of territory here, taking a bit of territory there. And they can be extremely unstable. And so it's not just the element of a willful Russian decision to reignite a war with a major invasion again, but it would also be sort of little incidents constantly building up, which I think would be very, very dangerous and problematic. So I think there has got to be a lot of worry that if it is just going to be a ceasefire, even if it's a peace agreement, how durable will it be? How long could it last? Can Putin be trusted on this? And there will be those who will say, well, no, he's got what he wants. But again, and coming through all of these questions, one feeds into another, feeds into another. The previous question I talked about was about, exactly the appeasement. Many will feel, and I think for good reason, that Putin won't be satisfied in all of this. But whether it would be a case that a future regime in Moscow might take a very different approach and say, but a lot will then depend on what is held back. What are the incentives that you bake into any agreement that would encourage good long-term behaviour? And so this, again, is another element that I think will be so very, very important. What do you do? Do you phase Russian reintegration according to meeting very, very strict criteria? Or do you hold off altogether until Russia just gives back all the territory? Then again, you get into the split that I mentioned about between the United States, which looks very keen to try and rebuild business ties with Moscow, and the European Union, which takes a rather different view on all of this. So, I think there would be a worry about it. I think there are ways that maybe you can mitigate that. But the question is whether you can take those steps and maintain the fundamental sense of Western unity, which will be required to make that work. And that I'm not sure about. And I think this really does come down to this, why at the moment so many are worried about this great split between Washington and the European Union, or Washington and European countries, on how to deal with Ukraine, because this only works, whatever it is in terms of stabilization, whatever it is in terms of a territorial arrangement, ceasefire. This only really will work and be secure if the United States and Europe work together on it. If you've got Washington saying we want this better relationship with Moscow, and we're going to do our thing, you're on your own now, then I think the chances of a resumed war at some point sooner rather than later is going to be very high indeed. Unfortunately, I think that's all we have time for now. As ever, there were far more questions than I could hope to cover in just one video, and I may try to come back to more of them in another one. In the meantime, here are some more videos that you might find useful. Thanks so much for watching, and see you in the next video.